All right, I will present. Okay. I will be hosting the first part of this meeting until 11:30. But if this meeting goes beyond 11:30, I think Jianfei can.
You have another meeting?
Yeah, I have a conflict. Jianfei can host the meeting after that. So let's go to the first one. Discuss the implementation for this one. All right.
Yes, so I had created this issue based on one of our customers' feedback, and I only wanted to get feedback from the community if this seems reasonable to implement, and if anyone had any concerns about it. So it's a simple case where Galley is right now rejecting policies if you have multiple JWT sections with the same issuer, and if you the issue points to the relevant code, and it also has the example that we are trying to use basically. So if you scroll down, so we have
Oh, you have two JOT sections and
the same issuer.
The same issuer.
And different audiences. That's the use case, but because you have different trigger rules, they can't be in the same.
Okay.
So basically, you want to allow the same issuer, but
exactly
you want to have different audience, accept different audience for different paths.
Yes.
I
don't know if Yang Min is in the call. I had talked to him on Slack, and he had said at least that this looks like an implementation limitation and not an architectural limitation. Can someone confirm this?
So basically, currently we are using issuer as the index, basically as the key for different JOT sections. So in this case, you have the same issuer in the two JOT cases. So I don't think this is supported configuration.
Have we turned the key to?
You should, no?
Yeah. Just from, I guess the input we'd like to hear is whether there will be security implications, and if not, it's just implementation details, right?
Absolutely. I just want that confirmation.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't understand if there was a security risk, at least in my head. So if anyone else knows.
But this seems like common behavior. I mean, that's how usually JOT tokens are used on the internet. I mean, you typically have a single issuer and you are using different audiences in different URLs. That's standard JOT.
Totally agree with you, Kostin. That's my assessment too. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
if there's
so with the current spec, we can you can say allow all this audience. So any of the audience is accepted, but you don't want.
You don't want.
They want to bind particular audiences to particular paths.
Yeah, of course.
There's a lot of noise on Spike's. Yes, exactly. That what Spike said is the use case.
Is this better for audio?
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think the issue is just that the implementation is bugged and doesn't allow this. The API allows it. I don't think there's any security issues with allowing it, so we should just fix it up.
So in this case, what should be the key in the implementation?
Why do we need a key in the implementation?
Currently, they are using the issuer as the key, right?
I think Oliver is asking how do we fix it in the implementation.
I mean, I can add more details in the implementation in the issue if overall for the proposal, nobody has any limitations, because I don't want to derail the meeting with implementation. If you want to discuss, we can. We can make it a concatenation of few things.
One question. It seems like I'm not very familiar with the JOT section though. But it seems like we have included paths. Suppose we have excluded paths.
Yeah.
And we have audiences also as a repeated fields. It seems possible customer can configure things that overlap with overlapping passes with overlapping audience.
Totally agree. That should be a galley validation and rejection.
Yeah, I'm wondering, should we think more about what that validation should be? Right?
That's fair.
Yeah, because we are introducing more flexibility now. It might be a good time to think about that.
Well,
yeah, actually,
sorry, the flexibility already exists from the API point of view. We just reject it from galley during validation.
It exists flexibility of the overlap of the path. The including and excluding paths may already exist, but the audience is now.
Yeah. Actually, we are thinking the triggered rule part currently is an experimental feature. One way is we don't put it in the JOT policy, but instead here we just define the JOT issuer. So we can still use the issuer field to identify the JOT issuer. But the JOT and the audience relationship can be expressed in other places. For example, you can use the authorization policy to express it. That's one way to do it. So this way we don't complicate our JOT policy.
You would remove it from here, deprecate those fields in this API and move them to RBAC.
Yeah, currently the triggered rules are experimental feature.
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah. Because otherwise this field will become more and more complicated.
Because you are mixing authorization and authentication. That's a very good point.
Yeah, there can be a lot of different combinations of this relationship. Currently, you are using paths to relate to the audience field. You can also have other.
It's very similar to RBAC use case, seems to me. Yeah, after you authenticate the.
So if I can summarize, it feels like the authentication policy resource, the whole API will change where that will be limited to just authentication, and audiences and other claims that belong in authorization will be moved to a different API.
No, audience will stay there. So audience will just say, for this issuer, what are the allowed audiences? So you can list the product page and the reviews.
Why would you need that in the first place? Because you can accept if RBAC is including audiences, and it should.
But normally in authentication step, you want to verify the audience.
Why do you
audience
is audience is part of the
JOT token. Is intended for you. So
but that, if you verify it in RBAC, why would you have a redundancy?
Yeah, but it's just part of the authentication process. I think it's in the authentication like JOT spec standard.
It is part, but the meaning is that it's specific to the URL. So you have exactly like in 6. If you have audience,
the URL part we can move.
You cannot say accept all audiences or accept star audience because I don't know.
So when you just list all the accepted audience in the authentication page, in the authentication policy, and but move the relationship between the path and the audience, accepted audience in authorization policy.
My question is, where does user
the other way is you don't restrict the audience. You don't specify the audience in authentication.
That's what I'm saying. If you specify audience star, you don't specify audience in authentication. You have to put it in RBAC anyway.
Yeah, in RBAC you can restrict it. Yeah,
that's right.
Why would the user have to type twice? Type the audience in RBAC and then type it here as well.
So we can.
The normal practice is the audience. You need to verify audience at least.
You verify it on RBAC. Not why do you need to verify twice? That's my question. It's extra.
Is there any use case, or another question? Is there any use case that you want to have RBAC but need to use audience somehow? Is there a situation?
Exactly, and we're making the user experience a little more complicated now. Where if you're just doing JOT validation, you will have to create 2 resources and not just 1.
So my understanding is the RBAC and the authentication, they are orthogonal. So here it doesn't, so you define this authentication policy, doesn't mean you have to define counterpart in the RBAC policy. They are independent.
But so
No.
They are not independent. Authorization without authentication, authentication with authorization are meaningless. I mean, in reality, what you are doing here, you are performing authorization. You are taking over some part of RBAC and you are duplicating authentication. They are completely different. One is verifies the signature is good and the token is valid, and the other one is verify if it's allowed. What is expressed in this example is RBAC authorization.
Basically, the semantic here is in order to access this path, you need to present a JOT with this specific issue and the audience. But doesn't mean I have to. So, for example, my application just requires this JOT, but I doesn't have to define additional, RBAC repeat this thing, right? Because if I repeat it, then the user need to define it twice.
True, but what you are saying is that you are defining this API an authorization mechanism. You are saying that star is authorized if it has an audience with product page. That's RBAC. The fact that you express RBAC in this.
Where is the star coming from? I mean, what is here, this particular example? So basically, for two passes, there are two JOTs, one with a specific audience, another with another audience. So I think this is fine for API. It's just implementation detail, whether the implementation support that.
I don't think it's fine for API because
I think for in this use case, it basically says for this pass require this we only accept token from this audience, and this can be defined in the authorization policy.
Not that it can be; it is an authorization policy.
That's our recommendation because the authorization policy currently is. The semantics is pretty flexible, and we already have such.
So basically, then the proposition is to move this to authorization, not here. I think this is right now. The policy shown here is the current API, authentication API. But I think what the proposition is move to auth.
No, auth is already supported.
Already supported
any
So what I am hearing then is somebody can give me an equivalent auth policy on the issue, which we can use to get this behavior. I'm saying it does mean that the user experience is a little more weird because they have to define now two resources, which may be fine from the community point of view. I'm just saying that it feels more work for an end user.
The reality is that there are two different things.
Sorting out audiences is more of an authentication issue than authorization. I mean, these things kind of blur together, right? And audience is one that is kind of in this gray area, but I think in the way that people kind of logically think about JOTs, the audience is is more of an authentication issue, because it's supposed to be used to prevent replay, basically to limit the scope of replay, not to be some decision that you're making about access to a resource. It's like I want to make sure that if I use a token, somebody else can't impersonate me using that token somewhere else. So I think this stuff does blur together, but I think most people, when they think about JOTs and audiences, audience is something that's used in the authentication piece, not in the authorization piece.
That's how I've always used it. The issue here is the connecting audiences and issuer with the trigger rules, which is what Limin was saying.
I think there is a very simple way to know if something is authorization or authentication. Authentication, if the question is it true or false, I mean, is it valid or not valid? That's authentication. If it's allowed or not allowed, that's authorization. In this case, you are saying that reviews can it's only allowed if you have some parameters like audience review. Audience, it is part of allowing or not allowing. That's authorization, I would say.
No, people will say that this is about whether or not it's valid.
I agree.
I think if we are talking about the current Istio authentication policy, is the semantics is to access a certain path, you need to present a certain JOT, or you need to have MTLS. That's the semantic of current authentication policy.
For example, MTLS doesn't have the same notion. I mean, for MTLS, you still need to use RBAC. So that will creates a disjoint between what happens if you use MTLS for authentication and what you use JOTS. In one
That's
case,
not
you RBAC.
correct. For MTLS, as far as I understand, you don't have to define any RBAC policies.
Oh, you do. I mean, if you want to be secure, you definitely need to define RBAC policy. Otherwise, everyone is permitted. That's kind of
No. What I was okay.
But you can say I just want to use I just require MTLS in the authentication policy.
Exactly. I want to just encrypt traffic between services. That's orthogonal to who can access what, right?
Yeah, and MTLS doesn't have this problem because X509 certificates and that exchange doesn't give you a replayable bearer token. So
Yes.
audiences.
Yeah, I can see there are different opinions. You can
as an authentication.
Okay. So you can definitely put in the like what we do today in the authentication policy, and alternatively, this relationship can be moved to authorization policy. It's just how do we simplify the policies. So we can either add the like and or a lot of logics in the authentication policy, make authentication policy like perform some somewhat similar to authorization policy. However, we prefer not to do that. We want to keep the authentication policy simple. Don't introduce a lot of complicated logic and or if and not.
I mean, I think
just keep this logic in authorization policy only.
If we want to keep authentication policy simple, we have to kick out these like trigger rules on paths. That's where all this complexity is coming.
Yep, totally agree.
Right. Yeah, the trigger rule actually, currently it's an experimental feature, as I said. So we are still discussing how to move this forward. It's very likely these rules will change.
How it is. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is holding one of our customers. It's an issue for them, and we have to jump around hoops. So, Liming, if you can help me at least write some RBAC policies that you are saying will work, at least that piece moves forward, and then we can debate on the issue if you want to do a short-term fix or just do a long-term fix of removing trigger rules. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I can comment on this bug. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, add some examples.
Awesome. Okay, let's move on. New Istio authorization policy design.
Yeah, I added this one.
Okay. Do you want to present?
Yes.
Feel free to do that.
Oh, actually, can you open the doc? I can't see it on my calendar.
Let me.
Yeah.
Okay. I will just go off and then I will send this to you.
I know the doc. I just the meeting is not on my calendar.
Oh, the meeting, no. Oh, the meeting is not on your calendar?
Yeah.
Sorry. Give us a minute. Let me. You should be able to see it. Get it? I can send you the meeting link.
Okay.
to make it bigger.
Okay. Can I make it full screen? Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm trying to present this new authorization policy design. So we already had a current Istio authorization policy for quite a while. And after that, we have received a lot of user feedback, and we have done user survey, and we had many offline discussion whether this is a good model, how do we simplify the policy. So for this V2 design, these are our top level goals. We try to align with the new Istio config model. Basically, Istio authorization policy is part of Istio config. So we want to align with the rest of Istio config. And then we want to simplify the policy by introduce fewer number of CRDs. And we want to make the policy, improve the policy clarity and provide a better user experience. And also another one of the other goal is we want to allow this policy to be applied to ingress and egress gateway. And so these are the detailed design. So first, we are going to introduce a new CRD object. It's a namespace scoped CRD called the authorization policy. Inside an authorization policy, we define a list of authorization rules that apply to a target. So authorization policy has the following sections. The first one is a selector section. So the selector is basically a workload selector. So the reason we introduced this selector is to align with all the other Istio configs. So selector defines the target where the policy applies. And the next part is rules.
So half of the Istio, configuration currently is based on hosts, and very few of them are based on selectors.
Yeah. Wow. So actually, that's the new model we are moving to. So in the Istio config model proposal, which Sven, Louis, and Martin proposed, we are going to introduce a base label selector, which is the workload selector.
I can give you some background from networking perspective. I mean, we have a number of changes that requires that we be able to select. There are kind of corner cases related with the host mapping to a workload. So anything that is applied server side and including the sidecar API benefits from being able to use label selector, not depending on the service to IP mapping. Kind of.
I see. So we are going to move things like virtual services and destination rules towards that model eventually.
This is not client side. So everything that is result in a cluster remains with host probably.
Okay.
But everything that results in listener probably will need to move to work. Otherwise, we keep having the problems, the corner cases where we don't know if an IP, because we use IP as a primary key.
Okay.
And that creates all kind of synchronization problems.
Yeah, and also for authentication policy, we are going to move to use the label-based selection to select the target workload.
That falls into the server-side category.
Yeah. So everything server-side probably will evolve to this model.
So one benefit is this reduce one indirection, and this indirection sometimes can cause misconfiguration because the two services, they may map to the same actual workload, and then there will be conflicts. By using labels, they are less likely to have these conflicts.
Thank you. Yep.
Okay. So thanks for the explanation. So other than the selector, we have a list of rules. So these rules basically are the allow rules. In the future, we may also introduce other rules like deny or audit, but currently it's all allows. So let's. Yeah, so the label selector plus the namespace field in metadata defines the policy scope. If the namespace is set to a root namespace, in which case the root namespace, the default value of root namespace is Istio config, and it's configurable to other values as well. If the namespace is set to root namespace, the policy basically applies to all the namespace in a mesh. It basically becomes a mesh policy. This concept is also introduced in Istio config model.
It's not introduced in Istio config model, but in general, it's not tied to labels. It's for default values. The main issue with cross namespace label selection is that it's very hard to enforce. We have the same problem with gateway. The original gateway has the same problem where you define the gateway by labels, but the labels could change. Someone could create workloads with particular labels that would automatically get the config. So I think we need to discuss how this behaves in the Istio config namespace. Because you don't want to put a rule that and then breaks the entire configuration. It's a global settings that can take too much. But it's orthogonal. I mean, that's something that is discussed in the config working group, how to apply config, default configs basically.
Okay. Yes. So basically, so in this example, we define authorization policy, which is in NS1 namespace, and we have the selector app B. So basically, the selector plus namespace defines the target where the policy applies. It applies to the workloads with labels app B inside the namespace NS1. If selector is missing, if we don't have the selector portion, basically it applies to all workloads in a namespace. And it can apply to all workloads in a mesh if the namespace is the root namespace. Now let's look at the rules section.
So there is still, there's still a possibility of conflict there. So I can have two policies. Are we going to reject them if there are two policies in the same namespace with overlapping match selectors?
Yeah, good question. So currently we only support allow rules. So basically, the policy will not have conflict. You just after you add another policy, you basically give more permissions. Yeah. The policy basically they are additive.
So basically, if I create,
just keep adding.
Yeah.
If I have a namespace with a service, everything works. It's allowed by default because I have no policy. If I add one policy, it becomes denied by default, and only what is allowed is. Let's ignore the default mesh policy. Let's say I have a namespace. I have a service foo.
Okay.
By default, because I don't have any authorization policy in that namespace, everything is allowed by default.
Define any
it's denied by
policy?
default.
There is no default, denied by default.
So there's no policy applied to the.
No policy applied to that workload.
So it's everything is allowed. Yeah.
Then if you add the policy, authorization policy, any authorization policy that is matching the label, it becomes denied by default.
Right.
And the policies are additive.
Right.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. That sounds perfect.
Can we make I understand, and this works as long as all the policies can be additive. As soon as you go to a regex match, you break that paradigm.
We don't plan to support regex match.
Okay.
At the moment, yeah. We support prefix, suffix.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it just makes things a lot simpler.
Just to add to this, this question. So basically, this is for the authorization policy. For authentication policy, we will going to introduce order. So when there is a conflict, so the conflict will be resolved through the basically there will be a defined order. The first one in the order will be applied. So that one will have the.
That's a proposal.
Yeah, that's a beta. This the authentication beta.
Because that may or may not conflict.
No, that's not.
There's
not decided.
That's not decided. Okay, then focus on authorization.
Yeah, let's focus on authorization. Yeah. So the rule section defines a list of allow rules. Each row contains the from, to, and when blocks. The from part contains a list of sources. Each source has the following fields: principals, request principals, namespaces, IP blocks. So principals is basically the source peer principal. Request principal is the principal from the JOT token, basically. It's the combination of issue and the subject field.
Are the terms used anywhere? Request principal is the first time I see the request principal.
Principal is used in not way, like in
It basically matches the request.auth principal field attribute.
Should be JOT principal if it's specific to JOT. So principal is the one from MTLS and request principal is one from JOT, or what's the meaning? I'm confused here.
Here it's
Request principal is coming from JOT.
And principal?
Principal is coming from MTLS certificate.
Okay, so basically you are saying that principal is the MTLS son, one of the MTLS sons, and request principal is one of the JOT.
Yes. Yeah.
I thought that was configurable. Like, is in the authentication policy, don't you get to choose what gets put into the request auth principal attribute?
Yeah, that's the current behavior. In current behavior, there is a field called use origin or use source, right? Yeah, that will affect the request principal.
Is there a use case for having it that configurable? Because that's one of the problems we have. We have too many configurations and it's hard to, because I wouldn't know that principals is MTLS and request principal is JOT.
Can you imagine actually a scenario where you will have a role for the principal from MTLS and a role for what if?
Yeah, it's a common use case. You have intermediary service. So you say ingress is the MTLS principal because you want ingress to be authorized. Yeah. And then the request principal is actual users that made the request to ingress. Yeah. It's the most common use case for.
Yeah. So basically, you can think of request principal matches the request.auth.principal attribute. I think that's what we are going to match to.
So a user making a request to ingress with a JOT token, ingress is forwarding to the service. Mm-hmm. Service verifies that the ingress is the one that is forwarding the request, so not arbitrary people who may cut the JOT, and then it's checking the JOT secondary. Mm-hmm. I would really think we should evaluate if we should not be clear in the names what it is, because I don't know if people are not familiar with security and with the request principal for this is.
Actually, not only I'm a bit confused, but I'm a bit afraid of like mixing an authentication that is linked to what I would call the transport MTS and an authentication linked to the user itself, which is layer 7. And for me, it looks very weird to mix the two in the same set of rules. But I don't know, maybe I'm over. I don't want to overreact about that.
Yeah.
The rationale behind this have origin and the peer. So peer is basically transportation layer. A peer can be MTLS or can be JOT. The origin can only be JOT because the origin is basically the client. The client sends a JOT and forwarded by peer to reach the backend. So that's the reason they have distinguished these two concepts.
So
and you
ideally,
can choose which one.
Yes. So ideally, that should be an or instead of both, because as far as I know, very few people are doing MTLS plus JOT, both verification at the sidecar. So normally you will do JOT validation at ingress, and then you only need MTLS principal validation at services which the ingress reaches out to.
The scenario that you require both is, so you are workload sidecar, right? So you talk to ingress and you want this connection to be on MTLS, but at the same time, you want the client to present a JOT. So in that particular scenario, it's both. But I agree. There may be cases you only want, JOT or MTLS, but not both.
Basically, JOT token is forwardable inside the mesh. I think this is a common use case that you want to have validate both the source and the origin.
At the sidecar?
A sidecar, you validate a peer and origin. Origin is like a client.
No, here's a good point. I mean, typically you validate the JOT at ingress, you apply the RBAC at ingress, and then you assume that ingress has validated, you don't do a second validation.
Yeah, I think that's also the AP token, why we propose AP token, right? In the ingress, we want to like do the token exchange and exchange the origin JOT token into an AP token and include other context. And then we forward this token inside the mesh.
If you do that, that's the only time TLS termination at ingress makes sense. Otherwise, you are exposing yourself to replay attacks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm.
So I still say then it does.
But in that, still for that case, for the AP token case, still the workload sidecar verify it both has MTLS from the ingress, and also there is the JOT, the exchanged token.
So we should add that field then when the IP token comes in, no?
I think we already see a lot of customer use case.
For the authentication policy, in that case, it's require both, right? It's require both the MTLS and a token, the exchanged token.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so the next section is the tool field. In the tool field, it contains a list of operations. It basically says the allowed operation on the destination. So the operation field include operation include ports. You can specify a list of destination ports and path.
What is the destination port? Is the service port or the workload port? They're different.
The workload port.
Okay.
Yeah, the path. Path is HTTP path or gRPC method. Method is HTTP method. So these are the same fields as today we have in authorization policy, in RBAC policy. And we want to add the host field, which is a list of HTTP host headers. Yeah, and the last section is the WAN field. Inside the WAN, you can specify a list of key and value pairs. And the key is an Istio attribute name, and the value is all the allowed values.
What's the difference between two and WAN? Because all of them are also key and values.
So WAN is basically a shared context that can be applied to all the front-end tool, all the source and operation combinations.
Going back a bit to the previous, to the principal and request principal, if you allow key value pairs matching, shouldn't you use the same mechanism? Basically say, I mean, define what kind of credentials are authorized, like JOT, explicitly define what is allowed. Maybe some request is allowed if you authenticate MTLS only. Some requests is allowed only to authenticate with JOT tokens. Maybe there are other mechanisms of authentication we don't know about. Kerberos, that user may choose to trust for some URLs and not for other URLs. So wouldn't it be cleaner for users to know exactly what they accept, what kind of credentials they accept?
Oh, the credential part, I think it's in the authentication policy,
but
right?
Authentication
the authorization is based on the attributes.
In the authentication policy, you can make things optional, and you may want to say something like, you can check the health path, even if you're not authenticated, but other paths require authentication. So I guess right now we're saying you would have to check that in the when, because like we have those attributes that get set when authentication succeeds.
To give an example, let's say I have a site and I want /employees to require a Kerberos token because that's the internal policy inside. I want /public to require a JOT token, and I want some services URL to use MTLS, to require MTLS because MTLS is more secure than JOTs. Can you express this? I mean, can you express the fact that a particular URL is only authorized with?
So basically, actually, I want you to talk about it next. So for every field, we currently support exact match, prefix match, and suffix match. We also want to introduce the presence match. So in the use case you just mentioned, we can say for this path, the source principle has to exist.
Okay.
Require source principle.
So
or for this path, require
okay.
jot principle has to exist.
Okay,
Basically, it says it has to be authenticated first.
So you have an attribute of a field that indicates what was the type of the principal that was used.
Yeah.
Okay, principal and principal type. Okay, that makes sense.
The type of principle, yeah, is request.auth principle, which is a field in authentication.
And has a type jot or MTLS. Can you know what kind of credentials you got?
No, actually, currently the Istio attribute does not distinguish it's a jot or it's other OAuth token.
So we don't expect a user to want particular resources to protect it with MTLS and others with jot.
So that's defined in the authentication policy.
No, but it's different resources. I mean, you specify a rule that say, hey, this particular resource.
I want a jot or I want an MTLS, but after that layer, after the authentication layer, then after the authorization, there is no duplicate specification.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So MTLS certificate is in source of principle. So you can say principle has to exist. That means MTLS has to be yeah.
And then if you want Kerberos and other authentication mechanism, I mean LTS
that's likely to be a request principle. You can say request principle has to exist.
Previously, it was called a request or user, but I think it will be changed to request or principal, right?
Yeah, previously it's different. It's a user.
Request or user, I think.
If it's aligned with the telemetry names, I'm happy, but I'm sure they have a name for that as well.
There's connection.mtls in the telemetry today.
Yeah. Yeah, for other attributes, you can specify in the when part. So it's not like a first class field, but you can use any Istio attributes in the when field.
Okay. I just have one feedback for the ports. So there's a lot of confusion in Istio overall when the ports are service and when the ports are workload, because as far as I know, this is the only case where we're using workload ports. Is there a way to make it more specific and not just call it port?
And also the fact that the workload port may not match the service port and may not be consistent. So you may not even know. It may be a dynamic port that is, especially with Sidecar white box.
That's true. And this has been quite a bit of a nightmare for supporting
I think
people.
in this context, the ports means the workload port. It's not a service port.
The workload port is not a constant. It can change depending on workload. I may have a workload that listening on port 8000, another on port 88. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. So maybe I'm confused. So how about destination.port attribute? What does it map to? It's a service port or?
It's always a container port.
Yeah, but the container port again, it's problematic, and service port is problematic because when we do label selection, we don't actually know the service port because that's dynamic and it's coming from a different source.
Yeah, I mean the only thing that we can reasonably do today is the workload port. So maybe we need to name it workload port so that people know that's what they're getting. But if it's a requirement to match on service port, then we got to kind of go back to the drawing board and figure out a way to securely capture that information.
I just propose naming it appropriately for now.
Yeah, I mean that works.
So
it will be a challenge to implement.
Document saying it's workload port, right?
Well, document is one. I don't know if workload is even implementable, and the service will be a challenge to implement as well. I want to mention that virtual services, for example, don't have port. And the port may be a UDS socket in networking, maybe other things. So you don't know. The workload is not required even to have a TCP port to accept a connection. We support UDS-based forwarding.
No, but I mean, this is the port that Envoy is grabbing traffic from. Yeah. This isn't necessarily that the workload itself is listening on. This is the port that is coming in from the outside world. Yeah,
but Envoy can listen. There are core kind of use cases in multi-cluster where we aggregate workloads from multiple clusters and they don't share the same definition of endpoint. In console, for example, you can put whatever port you want. It doesn't have to be same port on each machine.
Well, I mean, that's fine. You will just have to write your policy with label selectors that do the right thing if you care about matching on port.
And label selection have their own problems. Shiram probably will faint if we add back labels.
So Costin, irrespective of the problems, the implementation will choose one way of doing it. I think the name should just reflect that reality.
My concern is if either of them is a viable solution and will work well. Can we get rid of them? Can we avoid using the port and use a host name only? Are there common cases where a workload listens on multiple ports and they don't have different service?
Yeah, I mean, a pretty common case is to have health check on a different port.
And Prometheus.
Yeah, I think we can.
We need to discuss the implementation because the reason we have the workload is to avoid the service port. So we don't have to, because a workload doesn't know what service it belongs to without paying replication delays and corner cases.
Yeah. But we are only talking about workload here, right? We're not talking about service.
If it's workload port, then again, the question is, do we require workload ports to be consistent across a multi-cluster mesh? So if you have a service, all workloads need to listen on the same port. That's already not supported by Sidecar white box API. So if you have white box API, you can have workloads in the same service, but go into different ports. Maybe it's okay. Maybe if it's the policy is applied in each cluster separately, maybe it will work with workload ports.
Yes, that's the thing.
Policy is applied locally. So the local envoy will know what port it's listening on, will know what port the packets came in on.
But the user writing the policy will not know which port envoy is listening on.
That's true. And so, like, they'll have to either use consistent ports in their application or write multiple policies.
Yeah. There is also a feature that is coming in 1.3, which is dynamic ports, where the port can be anything. I mean, user can, like, for RTC or other protocols that use dynamic ports. Anyway, we'll need to revisit it.
Let's move on. Yeah. So so for the when part, in the future, we may introduce the expression condition that comply with the cell syntax. If that happens, we may replace the key value pairs with a cell. Okay, so I have talked about the presence match and the implicit enablement. Actually, actually, I already mentioned it a little bit. So previously, we have the explicit enable Istio RBAC feature using a CRD called cluster RBAC config or RBAC config. Now we want to make it implicit. So basically, if you don't have a policy applied to a workload, that workload access is always allowed. We don't affect it. But if you have a authorization policy applies to that workload, then access to that workload is denied by default, unless there is an explicit rule allows it. So this is the same behavior as how Kubernetes network policy works today. I think this behavior is nice because it doesn't need an explicit CRD to enable it, and it basically allows the existing application to adopt the feature easily.
Yeah, and also the cluster, all cluster resources are no longer, we cannot be supporting the new installer.
Yeah, this will be deprecated.
And it's dangerous.
Right. So if you want the default deny all policy, and you can just define authorization policy with the empty rule, basically. And you can apply this policy on ingress and egress gateway. This is pretty easy. You basically simply apply this authorization policy using the selector Istio ingress gateway and in the Istio system namespace.
Or whatever the ingress is using, because you can have ingresses in the namespace. And we're using labels.
If you use a different label, of course. Egress is similar. You can apply to the egress gateway using the same mechanism. And these are some policy examples. If you want to have deny all policy, you basically define authorization policy. And put the namespace you want to deny, and then you don't put any rule inside policy. And if you want to have mesh level deny all, you basically apply this policy in Istio configure namespace, which is the root namespace. And if you want to have default allow rule policy, you define an empty policy or empty rule. The empty rule does not have any limitation restriction on the from, to, or when part. So basically allows everything.
Can I thank you for providing all those examples. One thing that it will be super useful both for us and for all the users who are going to use this API is to include an example of similar network policy from Kubernetes, how it looks like, and also maybe some examples from some mainstream servers that have similar authorization, like Nginx, Apache, servlets, or whatever.
You mean
how you take one example, the example you gave there with one of the rules, and list the equivalent examples.
Corresponding network
corresponding well, similar network policy, a similar Nginx configuration, similar Apache configuration, similar. Pick two of them. So people who are currently using one of those products have an idea how to translate to the new authorization policy, and also to give people an idea about the wording used, because the wording definitely is not the same. I mean, I know for servlets, for example, the wording is completely different, and it will be good to at least figure out the patterns and know how to translate from one concept to another. Many people are.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I think for network policy, the deny all and allow all are very similar semantics. You can.
I was talking about with principals, with attributes. I mean, URLs, for example, there is a request constraint, for example, in servlet, and each of them has a. And principals, request principals in particular. That's one of the reasons I'm asking for this, because again, I think that there are some patterns.
I don't know if all the existing policy supports that, but if they do, I do.
Yes, trust me.
Quick question for the egress policies. I see that you have the label selector for an egress proxy. In cases where I don't have an egress proxy, but I want to use sidecars to enforce egress policies, how will I do that?
Sidecars, basically, you have a particular specific sidecar which you want to.
No. That's a request. I mean, definitely don't want to. No, absolutely.
Basically, the idea is you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think this. Let's not mix sidecar egress policies and destination rules.
Sidecar egress policy. Okay, I see.
No, I'm talking about if I don't have an egress proxy, but I want to say only specific workloads are allowed to talk to google.com/something.
I think we should postpone this for a future version, because that's mixed. We are discussing revamping the destination rule API, and there are all kind of implications, and anyway, it's easy to bypass. So the sidecar it's not a policy that you can enforce really, because the sidecar can easily bypass. An application can easily bypass the sidecar right now. So until we have CNI and strong separation, because it will confuse things. I mean, applying the same RBAC for inbound and outbound is what got us into a lot of troubles, and all the confusion between.
I see. I'm because there was an egress policy example. That's why I was.
So maybe we can say that if you want to impose rules on the egress traffic, you should enable an egress gateway and apply the rules on an egress gateway.
Yeah. So this is assuming you have an egress gateway.
Yeah.
Okay.
And use Kubernetes network policy to block any traffic, so we prevent application from actually doing any bypass. And
currently we are under, so authorization policy is basically the ingress side. It's the server side policy.
And it's very good to keep it at least this one will not be confusing.
So other examples like you can allow all authenticated user. In this example, we are saying either the source principal is not empty or request principal is not empty. And you can limit access to the current namespace. You can say all the workloads from NS1 namespace can access basically, yeah, can access the workload inside the same namespace.
For this one in particular, this duplicates the export to in all the APIs that we have. So we probably need
sidecar.
So the sidecar API, actually the service has an annotation. So networking defines an export to, which can apply in sidecar, destination rule, and a lot of other things. And right now it's not enforced. So probably either need to be translated or automatically translated by Gali, or someone will need to make sure that the user who's putting an export to automatically has this applied.
Yeah.
It's very important because export to it's also used for a lot of other things.
Yeah, and this is typical like a service to service authorization, and you can add constraints like from constraints and to operation constraints. Yeah, and this example is saying all the workloads from front-end namespace can access workloads in back-end namespace with availability label set to external. And I have some end user authentication case, like using the request.auth claims. So yeah, I also want to mention that we are going to change the API version to security.istio.io v1 beta. So yeah, so we hope this will become a relatively stable API. Yeah, so, and as you see, the policy becomes simpler because currently we only have one CRD, which is the authorization policy. Instead of previously, we have service role binding, and RBAC config. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me know if you have further comments.
One thing, I mean, it is definitely simpler than before, but given the export tool that I mentioned, which is basically in any service, you can put an annotation saying export to, and you specify namespace / service account. That seems even simpler than this. I mean, if we can have a way to automatically translate and incorporate in this specification saying that users can also express the simplest case with just the annotation or the export to in the virtual service and in the networking API.
For the namespace isolation
for the
case.
common case where all you want to say is that this service can only be accessed from service foo in namespace X. So you have a list of namespace / services or service accounts that are allowed to access a service. That's how export to is defined in terms of visibility.
Okay.
And that's the most convenient because, again, it's something that users need to do anyway for networking purpose, for visibility. So if they do it for visibility, then there is no need for them to express the same thing twice. So if I'm saying that my service can only be accessed from it's only exported to foo, that implies that there is an authorization as well. And probably the user should not have to duplicate.
I thought that just implies the config distribution.
It's not. I mean, it's a limitation of the implementation that currently we are not enforcing. It export to has a meaning that it should only be usable from that particular location.
If that's the case, then you're right. You don't need authorization policy for most of the cases.
For the simple cases, I mean, we definitely need for JOT tokens and complex matches, but for service-to-service communication, that will be even simpler than that, and will solve the visibility problem as well at the same time.
Yeah, I think network policy, like the export tool feature is mostly for the coarse grain isolation, right? Like for the namespace level isolation, you can use
it's a way to specify the identity of the which namespace isolation. That's the most common use case. Yes.
Yeah, but for the for all other use cases, I think we still need an authorization policy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I'm just saying that if all you need is namespace coarse isolation, we could probably just use that one.
Yeah. Yeah, and also currently the namespace for in the authorization case, the implementation is we actually extract the namespace field from the certificate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
So, yeah. So in the case of MTLS does not exist, it's not applied. Actually, we don't
That's
enforce it.
an interesting discussion. I mean, what does even
we can
authorization
extend that.
without authentication? I don't know if it makes any sense. It's kind of
No,
pretend.
but in the network case, when you say namespace level isolation, you also want to apply to without.
No, if you don't have authentication, then probably just ignore it. You can ignore any exporter because it's not enforceable.
Okay.
So I don't think the question is what happens if you have a network layer security, if you have IPsec or other things where actually you have a secure network, in which case I don't know how this will be expressed. That's an open issue. And we have users who use IPsec based networks and for security.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Is it implemented? What's the implementation status for this?
The API is already for review. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
So 1.4 is a target?
Yes.